Thank you, everybody, for joining us. As I say, this is the final presentation of just the fall 2024 semester here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, the Max Kade Institute for German American Studies. Very, very pleased to welcome two speakers this evening. The first person who's going to be speaking is Sydney Norton, and Sydney is an independent scholar, translator, and educator in St. Louis, who earned her doctorate in German literature and cultural studies at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. She's the editor of a volume called Fighting for a Free Missouri: German Immigrants, African Americans, and the Issue of Slavery, which was a collection of essays published by the University of Missouri Press in 2023. And she will be followed by her co-presenter and co-researcher. Her name is Cecilia Nadal. There's Cecilia in the back there. Hello, Cecilia. Cecilia is a sociologist. She's also a playwright, and she's a community engagement professional who uses the arts and history to bring diverse cultural groups together to co-create and problem solve. For the past 6 years, she has organized and developed symposia and local dialogue groups on the topic of the shared history of German immigrants and African Americans throughout the state of Missouri. So please join me in welcoming virtually our speakers this evening, Sydney Norton and Cecilia Nadal.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Cecilia and I are both very honored to be speaking for the Max Kade Institute, and we look forward to sharing our research with you. I'm going to be showing some slides, so I'm going to share the screen. So my research on Missouri German abolitionists dates back to the summer of 2015, when I became interested in organizing an exhibition on the topic. My husband and I had taken a weekend trip to Hermann, Missouri, the town that was established by Germans from the Philadelphia Settlement Society in 1838. In the gift shop of the Historical Museum, located in the German school that was built in 1871, I began thumbing through a paperback illustrated history of Hermann. There was a lot written about the wineries created by the industrious immigrants, their innovative farming and gardening techniques, and striking photographs of the picturesque town and its historic buildings. I then came upon a very brief paragraph about Hermann being a hotbed of anti-slavery activity, and that early German immigrants who settled there had published newspapers that spoke out against slavery. This vocal anti-slavery perspective, while commonplace in the northern states during the 1840s, was quite radical in rural Missouri, as Missouri had come into the Union in 1821 as a slave state, and many of the Anglo-American landowners in the fertile Missouri River Valley owned slaves. And if you look at this, this is called a view of the slave population, and it was part of the 1860 census. And if you see this river, this is the Missouri River all along here, and this is where most of the enslaved people lived because it was extremely fertile, and the people who owned the land there were pretty well off. So one little square, these are in little units, and one little square of the unit is 100 enslaved people. And if you see 10, you see these long bars, that's by the thousand. So there were literally thousands of enslaved people living along the Missouri River Valley. And this is where Hermann is located. As a Missouri transplant, born in Oklahoma and raised in New York City, I was not well acquainted with Missouri history. But as I began researching the topic, it soon became clear that the activism of anti-slavery German immigrants in Missouri, as well as their courageous service in volunteer Union regiments, was pivotal for both Missouri, a state governed by the closet secessionist Claiborne Jackson, as well as for the country at large. The exhibition, Fighting for a Free Missouri, was shown at St. Louis University's Center for Global Citizenship and traveled to Hermannsdeutschheim State Historic Site, where it was exhibited in one of the historic German houses there. Cecilia Nadal, whom you will meet shortly, came across the catalog essay and was inspired by it. And here you see Cecilia in this picture. She began conducting her own research on the shared histories of African Americans and Germans, the two largest ethnic groups in Missouri. She organized interdisciplinary symposia in which scholars of African American history and of German American history came together to discuss these connections. And here, this is in Herman. She actually organized these groups in various towns in both rural Missouri and in St. Louis. And these are all people from Herman or areas outside, just not far from Herman. An important outcome of our work is the publication of an anthology on Germans and African Americans in Missouri. Questions that the book and this presentation explore and attempt to answer are: did Germans work closely with Missouri Blacks toward the common goal of ending slavery, or did they fight valiantly for the cause yet remain separate from the people for whose rights they were fighting? To what extent did anti-slavery Germans stay true to their Republican democratic values in their personal lives? Were the Germans who fought for emancipation of like mind in other questions of social justice? Did they also support African American suffrage, voting rights for women, equal access to education? When examining the German anti-slavery movement in Missouri, it is helpful to know that African Americans have been present in the territory since long before statehood, long before Germans settled in the region, and long before there was a United States. We learn from John Wright, one of the leading scholars of Missouri African American history, who together with his son contributed an informative piece on Missouri African Americans to this volume, that some of the earliest Black inhabitants were enslaved, and they came to the region with French settlers. The laws concerning French slavery in Missouri were outlined it's what is known as Code Noir, and were first issued by King Louis XIV of France. And this is a later edition of Code Noir from 1744. Code Noir stated that enslaved people had a right to own property. They were allowed to work for themselves on feast days and holidays, and the money they earned and saved could be used to buy their own freedom. The enslaved also had access to courts to settle disputes. An enslaved person's testimony could be admissible in courts as evidence. Enslaved families could not be separated legally through a sale, and a request from an enslaved person to purchase his or her own freedom could not be denied. Soon after the transfer of French territories to the United States in 1803, as Anglo-American anxieties about the possibility of slave revolts increased, much more stringent policies regarding the legal rights of the enslaved and even of free Blacks began to take effect, eventually eradicating the protective laws that people of color from colonial times had counted upon. It was during this period that the two waves of German settlers arrived. Most of the German abolitionists, as most of you know, I'm sure, in Missouri, were 48ers, young and idealistic revolutionaries in the German states who fought for freedom from Napoleonic rule and later unsuccessfully against the despotism of the German princes. In the 19th century, The great majority of citizens of the German states could not vote. They could not speak openly about their views on politics. They paid exorbitant taxes to princes and got little in return, had limited opportunity for land ownership, as the members of the aristocracy were the landowners. The 48ers, as well as some of their predecessors who had arrived in Missouri in the 1830s, were attracted to the United States because it had, against the odds, won the War of Independence against the English monarch. These visionaries were educated and outspoken, and their ideals developed out of a rich tradition of political theory, debate, and activism. They admired the American Constitution and took it seriously, and many were distraught by the fact that slavery was a legal and accepted practice in Missouri. Two important early figures in Missouri's anti-slavery movement were Karl Strehli and his brother Edvard Mühl, who settled in Hermann in 1838. They soon became editors of the Hermanner Wochenblatt and wrote frequently against slavery as early as the 1840s. Mühl wrote, "We hold ourselves as free men who did not escape slavery in our old homelands to support it here in America." He also wrote against the 1850 fugitive slave laws, the law requiring that all fugitive slaves be returned to their owners, even if they had escaped to a free state. He described the law as, quote, "the disgraceful shame to our Union," stating slavery is nothing other in our republic but the representation of the privileged aristocracy and tyranny, comparable to the actions of the princes in Germany. Mühl also reported slave sales, the separation of families, lynchings, and beatings, and in 1853, he began a serialized publication of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin as a front-page feature that ran for 26 weeks. And that was written in 1853. So imagine having it translated within the same year and publishing it in a state, in an area of the state that was pro-slavery. Of course, it was in German, so maybe their neighbors didn't understand it. Here is, if you've ever been to Hermann, you would have seen the Strehli house, and they lived in the house, and below in the basement was the press room. And here you see the printing press for the Hermanner Wochenblatt, and on the right side you see Edvard Mühl's type box, which he brought from Cincinnati to Hermann in 1843. Another prominent gray, and I assume most of you are you understand the difference between the grays and the greens, but in case some of you don't, the grays were the older older generation of Germans, and the greens were what the older Germans called the 48ers because they found them to be green. Another prominent gray was the distinguished Friedrich Muench, a former Lutheran pastor and theologian who in Missouri became a skilled farmer, vintner, and politician. He and his family came to the United States with the Gießen Immigration Society and settled on a farm in Dutzau in Warren County, also located in the Missouri River Valley, really not very far from Hermann, maybe about 20 miles. Muench wrote prolifically on diverse topics, ranging from religion and rationalism to farming and politics. His prolific pieces on abolition are both nuanced and persuasive, and he was celebrated locally, nationally, and abroad in German language newspapers in Philadelphia, New York, Cincinnati, and Germany, and of course, St. Louis. Muench's gift for polemics is apparent in an opinion piece published January 29th, 1862, in St. Louis's Anzeiger des Westens, in which he argues that it is the course of the Enlightenment to transform society that will ultimately end slavery. He writes, "Is the slavery question really insoluble? Must the growth of enlightenment, which has changed and improved everything and overcome one after another of the perverted institutions of humanity, cease its work at the institution of Black slavery and leave it forever untouched? We assume at the outset that every maladjustment arising from human error is capable of a human solution, however difficult it might be. To declare the failing to be beyond recovery is moral cowardice, and often nothing more than mean and hypocritical self-indulgence." Muench campaigned with the German revolutionary Friedrich Muench and was elected to Missouri's legislature, where he served throughout the Civil War. His youngest son, Berthold, was among the first volunteers, and he died at the age of 17 in the Battle of Wilson's Creek. Muench was among the few Republicans who, during the years of Reconstruction, continued to work for legislation that would ensure political and social equality for African Americans. He concentrated largely on securing voting rights for Blacks, convincing a large majority of his neighbors in Warren County to vote yes on the Black Suffrage Amendment of 1868. And we know that he had a big influence in the area because all of the surrounding districts did not vote yes. It was overwhelmingly no against suffrage rights, except for Muench's district. African American men in Missouri did not, of course, receive the vote until 1870, and women, both Black and white, were excluded from voting until 1920. Despite the honorable actions of some of the earlier German immigrants, a few of the more prosperous ones, including Muench, adapted to the ways of the landowning gentry who succumbed to purchasing enslaved people. The United States slave schedule of 1850 in Warren County shows, for example, that a young enslaved woman was living on his property. At this time, Muench's eldest daughter, 21-year-old Paulina, left home to marry Gordian Bush, a horse breeder and vintner from the area. The slave schedule shows that Bush had also purchased a slave for his new household. Paulina expresses her ethical quandary regarding slave ownership in a letter to her aunt in Germany. "It has been 2 years now since my husband bought a Negro maid of 13 years for $820, because you can't get any help here. I was reluctant for so long, as I can't stand the thought that I would own a slave, because I have always been disgusted by this trade. Yet what can you do when you live in a country where such a thing is allowed, and you can't help yourself in any other way? One such a creature of good deed, if one does as we have, buying her from a hardened sir, and then treated humanely, as good as our own child. She has regular meals and clothing, is handled benevolently, and of course her freedom is absent, but in its stead she has not worries." Paulina's words shed light on the ethical predicament of what Missouri Germans who were accustomed to servants in Europe experienced as pioneers in a sparsely inhabited state in which there were few wage laborers available, but ample opportunities to purchase enslaved people. While the choices they made are, from our contemporary perspective, unjustifiable and hypocritical, there is evidence that it was easier for the Greys to adapt to the social mores of the landowning class. Noteworthy, however, is that the Herman settlers, who also belonged to the earlier wave of immigrants, did not own slaves. The 48ers, who arrived between 12 and 15 years later, were repelled by slave ownership, both in theory and practice. The prominent revolutionary Friedrich Muench, for example, rejected the slave state of Missouri altogether as a possible residence, purchasing instead a farm in the neighboring free state of Illinois. Most of the 48ers, aside from a small number of Latin farmers, settled in St. Louis, as the city possessed greater opportunities for employment and a well-established social network. At their time of arrival, the city was in a state of monumental flux in terms of both commerce and social relations. It had surged in population due to the vast number of Germans and Irish pouring in, and it had also attracted both northern and southern settlers who were ideologically, if not yet socially, at odds with one another. And a lot of the people in Germany and in other parts of Europe would see these prints because they would be published in both the United States and then published abroad. And so they were, of course, very appealing to them, and it made them want to come. Despite the city's growing number of northern and immigrant voices that were opposed to slavery, St. Louis was the largest slave market in the state. Slaves were sold on the eastern steps of the city's courthouse. Not far away were slave pens where the enslaved were shackled and held overnight before transit. German immigrants were witnesses to this, yet they also encountered African Americans in other capacities. Members of both groups worked as laborers at the river ports, and this is a very famous lithograph by John Casper Wilde. African Americans sometimes rented rooms from Germans and also patronized their shops. The St. Louis Turners rented their downtown hall to African Americans for special meetings and balls. And when the drive for Black suffrage began in 1864, Central Turner Hall hosted speeches by important civil rights leaders. John Langston, the president of the National Equal Rights League, as well as Frederick Douglass, spoke at Turner Hall in St. Louis. Opinions within the sizable German immigrant anti-slavery camp were, however, diverse. One can get an idea of the variety of political perspectives by examining the contrasting beliefs and actions of Henry Boernstein. His actual name was Heinrich Boernstein, prominent St. Louisan and 48er, and those of his son Augustus Sigismund. Heinrich was born in Hamburg and raised in Lemberg, at the time Austrian Poland. As a young man in Paris, he made a name for himself in journalism as the publisher of Vorwärts, a cultural and political magazine for German-speaking émigrés. After the failed Republican uprisings, he emigrated with his wife and 2 sons to the US, and within a year, he was offered the editorship of Anzeiger des Westens, which was the largest German-speaking paper and the first one, I believe, west of the Mississippi. The Anzeiger was at the time a moderate Democratic publication, as was the entire population of about 25,000 Germans in the city. But as the ideological battles concerning slavery intensified, Boernstein shifted his allegiance to Lincoln's new anti-slavery Republican Party. He was, in fact, influential in miraculously getting the Republican Party on the ballot in a mostly pro-Southern state. His name appears here on the first statewide Republican ticket from 1860, and he's running for the superintendent of schools. And you see a second notable German immigrant Republican, who will be talking about him, Arnold Krekel, and he's running for Attorney General. Boernstein responded with great enthusiasm to Lincoln's call for Union volunteers, recruiting scores of Missouri Germans through his newspaper and successfully leading a volunteer regiment to occupy the pro-Confederate militia encampment at Camp Jackson. Soon after, Lincoln rewarded his efforts with a plum position of American consul to Bremen. Heinrich accepted the position and moved to Europe and passed the newspaper on to his son. But Augustus was politically more radical than his father. Heinrich, as well as the majority of the Anzeiger's readers, favored gradual emancipation and remuneration to the slaveholders. Augustus, on the other hand, supported immediate emancipation and publicly criticized what he believed to be Lincoln's hesitant policy regarding the issue. Shifting the tenor of the Anzeiger to reflect these ideals, the paper experienced a rapid decline in readership, and in 1863, he sold it to join the United States colored troops. Augustus served as a major in the 4th and 6th regiments, fighting valiantly alongside his troops in the bloody battles of Chaffin's Farm and New Market Heights in Virginia. This is his company, and I have until this time been unable to find a picture of Augustus. It's very mysterious. There's very little written about him, but I came across an incredible letter he wrote to his superior during the war, and I'm going to share that with you. Augustus's courage and dedication to his troops is evident in a 4-page letter that he wrote from the front to his wounded superior, Colonel Samuel Duncan. In this letter, the young Boernstein conveys the great respect he had for his troops and profound sadness about the massive casualties in his company. "There are but few of us left," he wrote, "but they deserve the names of veterans, and I will fight hell and the rebels with them." He also describes the valiant actions of one soldier, Christian Abraham Fleetwood, whom you see here in the corner. He recommends him for a Medal of Honor. Fleetwood picked up the national colors, he wrote. "We lost 200 men, but our honor is untarnished." Closing his letter with the emotional and dramatic flourish, "Yours until death," the young Boernstein conveys his passion for the ideals of freedom and equality. The United States colored troops proved to be a realm in which Germans and African Americans encountered one another and in some cases developed social bonds. Finally, I would like to close with a copy of Missouri's Ordinance of Emancipation, ratified January 11, 1865, 11 months before the ratification of the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. This is amazing because these radical Republicans, many of them were German immigrants, signed this into law before the enslaved people in the rest of the country were freed in a slave state. It's pretty incredible. The convention at which the ordinance was drawn up was shared by German immigrant lawyer Arnold Krekel, a radical Republican who, in addition to supporting Black suffrage in the legislature, worked with former members of the 62nd United States Colored Infantry of Missouri to help found Lincoln Institute. The first, this is a picture of Arnold Krekel. Lincoln Institute was the first African-American school dedicated to the education of the formerly enslaved, and he worked together with these members of the 62nd and the 65th Regiment of the United States Colored Troops. And they also donated what money they had to build this university. Krekel aggressively fundraised for the school and taught law and history at Lincoln for 10 years without pay. And here, I don't know if any of you have had the opportunity to visit Jefferson City, but it's in Jefferson City. And Lincoln University was known to be the Black Harvard of the Midwest. It's because of its incredible faculty and its incredibly gifted students between like 1920 and 1970. The efforts of such men as Krekel, Muench, the two Boernsteins, and Mühl, who fought for and dedicated their lives to advocating freedom and equality, had a powerful and lasting influence on Missouri and the United States. While they were unable to erase the negative societal effects caused by racism born of slavery, they helped to create a more just and free society, one on which later generations have built and continue to build. And I'm finished, but I wanted to just mention at this exhibition, I borrowed this 62nd USCT battle flag from Lincoln University. And if you visit Lincoln, you see this incredible sculpture of all the people who were involved in founding the university. And there was actually a hall called Barnes Krekel Hall. Barnes was an formerly enslaved entrepreneur who did very well. And Krekel, it was a women's dormitory and cafeteria. And unfortunately, they tore it down and they rebuilt a hall, and it's called Founders Hall. And Cecilia and I are both interested in getting the names put back because we believe they deserve the honor. That's all. I'm going to stop my share. Okay, and I'm going to pass the baton to Cecilia.
Good evening, everyone. How are you? I know I can't hear the answer, but I'm sure you're fine. I'm so happy to be with you today. I'd like to open with answering the question that probably most of you have, and that is, how did an aging African-American woman become intrigued by the story of German immigrant abolitionists? And the story is rather remarkable. I will tell you first that my background is one as a sociologist, a playwright, and a producer. For 23 years, I ran a nonprofit called Gitana Productions, which had the express objective of using theater, music, and history as a vehicle for bringing diverse people together. It takes a little time to explain that, but it's very important because it's a mission not just of presenting on stage, but it's a mission of bringing people together. One historic evening, I went to St. Louis University to meet with Dr. Borgmeyer, and he showed me a book. I'm going to show it to you now, all of 30 pages written by Sidney. And in those 30 pages, before I read it, he said to me, "Cecilia, I think this is a story you could do something with." And I looked at it, German immigrant abolitionists in Missouri, and nothing stuck in my head with that. In fact, it took 6 to 7 months before I actually returned to this book to read it in earnest. I did read it, and I was astounded. First of all, in my background, certainly I've taken history classes. I'm very familiar with the abolitionist movement, but this emphasis on German immigrant abolitionists was very unique to me. Having worked with immigrants in the here and now, I'm very aware that when they move into a new homeland, they have to adapt, they have to learn a new language in most cases, they have to find out where they're going to live. And in my head, I had to ask the question, how could these people, in coming to the United States and moving into the wilderness of the United States, have, many of them, a compassion for the status of slaves during that time? Certainly, in my mind's eye, with all the things that they had to deal with individually, the idea of them taking time, not everyone, but many of them, to work with the problem of slavery was touching to me, because I understand what one has to go through as an immigrant. So I did read the material that Sydney put together so well. And like most historians, she was very concise. She spoke to the behaviors. And then as a sociologist and a writer, I had to go backwards. And I had to say, what led to these behaviors? Why did they present themselves in the way that they did? So let's take an example of that. If we go to Arnold Krekel, who for me is one of the most astounding German immigrant abolitionists that I have read about. And I've now at this point read about many of them. But Arnold Krekel came to this country at the age of 17. He and his family, about 8, came on the boat that took 2 months to get to the United States. On his way to Missouri, he lost his mother. She died because of the hardship. They had to walk for 160 miles. And in losing his family and getting to St. Charles, they conducted themselves as land surveyors. So they cleared the lands for other people. And this man would eventually become a federal judge and a defender of African Americans who were enslaved and freedmen. And so the question in my mind was, with all the hardship that he had to go through, and even when he had acquired a great deal of notoriety amongst his peers who were both non-German and German, the fact that he would reach out to a group of people who, in many's imagination, were simply a source of problems, whether you were an enslaver or whether you were an abolitionist, it was politically incorrect at that time to speak out for such people, but yet he did. And so as a writer and sociologist, it was very important for me to take the facts that Sydney put together and think about, why did they do what they did? How did the Black people who were around them respond to them, hearing that they were speaking in German, that they looked very different? Many of you have heard of the Know Nothing Party, and it was very clear that the Know Nothing Party was doing everything they could to make it difficult for Germans to become citizens in the United States of America. And yet with that problem, they still, many of them, helped in giving aid to African Americans. So I would take the facts work backwards and look at what did it mean about the relationships and how long have these relationships been going on. And I was rather amazed. Let me just give you some of the things that I learned in my short journey. And I've been working on this now for close to 5-6 years. The first thing I learned is that the shared involvement of African Americans and Germans dates back to the American Revolution. And there is a book that's written by Ortlip and Green that talks about how the interchange between African Americans and Black people has been going on for 200 years. It is amazing that during the American Revolution, that was the one time early on that there was not segregation between Blacks and fighters. You know very well that during the Civil War, even World War I and even II, there was segregation even within the military, but not during the American Revolution. There are about 500,000 slaves that were in the United States, and most of them joined the Patriots. But then there was the issue of those who were joining the British, and the Hessians worked with the British, and there were African American slaves who worked with the British as well, primarily because the British gave a better deal on what would happen at the end of the rainbow, and that is that they would have freedom. So this relationship has been going on a long time. So I was moved by learning that. The other thing that I had to do, though, is to ask the question, why haven't we heard about German abolitionists? Given the impact that they have had, it was curious to me that we had not heard much about it. One of the things that I did early on was to visit websites of German cultural organizations across the United States, about 40 of them. And I looked at all of them to see if there was any discussion about German abolitionists. And I could not find it. It wasn't there. Then I called the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education in the state of Missouri, and I asked them, in your curriculum, how much do you deal with the issue of slavery? Well, you won't be surprised when I tell you that our grade from A to F in being able to adequately address slavery in America is probably about a D. And there are some people who have some thoughts about why that's the case. Nikita Stewart wrote an article in the New York Times that asked the question, why don't we deal with the issue of slavery more than we do? And she concluded that because there's such shame that exists, shame on the part of white Americans and on the part of African Americans, that we just didn't want to dig into the weeds. We'd rather just kind of surface over that. Well, here's the problem. If you only address the worst of what exists in the institution of slavery, then you don't have room to talk about the nuance, the gray part, where people really did do exceptional things. And when I learned that there was not discussion about this, I thought, you know what? Blacks and Germans and white Americans are losing not to know this information, not to look at the gray and put it under a microscope. So let me give you some examples of what I did to put this under the microscope. Going back to Arnold Krekel, we knew that he helped to start Lincoln University. After we looked at his background, and I've mentioned to you that he was young, 17, he had to learn English. He became a lawyer. He opened his own German newspaper in St. Charles. He became a federal judge. Why would such a man of such stature, honored by all, take so much of his time to work with colored infantrymen who came back from the war? And they told him and a number of others, James Milton Turner, we need a school of education. If we don't get an education, we're not going to be able to make it. And this man, though esteemed by all, did several things. Number one, he became a founding board member to start what was then Lincoln Institute. And then he would go on to become a teacher and in political economy, and he would teach former slaves and members of the colored infantry information about political economy for 10 years. He was on the board of directors for 22 years. Now, step back for a moment and think about what that means. But understand that Arnold Krekel had 2 slaves. By all accounts, that's a contradiction. If we look at this as humanitarians and the times and the nuance and the gray, and we look at where he came from, where he was in the state of Missouri, how he became the chairman of the Emancipation Convention to free slaves, and then work at an institution for 22 years. That does not minimize or take away the fact that he had 2 slaves, but it does allow us to see that there are multiple dimensions to this man and what he believed and how. And when I think about poor colored infantrymen coming to him and saying, would you do this? Knowing that he was a German immigrant, I think he was touched by it. I think he believed it to the core. I think that what he did, which many Americans do and others in other countries, is he kind of went along with the Joneses, hoping it would change and go from there. When I was presented with this in-depth information about Arnold Krekel and many others like Friedrich Muench, which Sydney mentioned, and certainly Heinrich Boernstein and his son August Boernstein, who would lead a colored infantry. It was clear that it was important for Blacks, whites, and Germans to hear this story. I felt so strongly about it that even though most of my work with the company was as a producer, and I had written several plays, I decided to write this play. And I thought it was important for someone African-American to do so because it would allow me to talk about all elements of what it meant to be a German immigrant during the Civil War and beyond. So I did that. I wrote the play, took it to Herman. I have to tell you that I was quite nervous about that. As you've learned from Sydney, Herman is a German town and has been for a long time. And I had some doubts about how Germans would respond to an African-American woman writing a play about their people. And to my, I was astounded to be well received by those that were there. And there was something that happened that I should not have been surprised by. Largely, what touched them is that they learned something about their own people that they did not know, even though they lived right in Herman. And they were edified by learning of the role that German immigrants played, edified in knowing that they contributed in a positive way. The other thing that I found out is that it is important to deal with both the good and the bad. There's no whitewashing, but if we deal with people as people, we certainly have to look at it all together. I want to share a quote with you from a historian and a playwright who I admire very much, and listen very carefully to what he says about history. He says, to be hopeful in bad times is based on the fact that human history is not only of cruelty, but also of compassion, sacrifice, courage, and kindness. If we see only the worst, it destroys our capacity to do something. If we remember those times and places where people have behaved magnificently, this gives us the energy to act. And if we do act in however small a way, we don't have to wait for some grand utopian future. The future is an infinite succession of presence and a marvelous victory. That's Howard Zinn, who is a historian and playwright. Needless to say, I knew that this story was important to the state of Missouri, Black people, white people, and German people. By the way, and I'm not ashamed of saying this, it wasn't until I put Germans under a microscope that I was reminded that not all white people are the same. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? Anyway, it is important to immerse ourselves in the culture of other people to understand them. We're going to share with you a video about what we did to bring the story in a play, but take it further than that, not just something that you come and watch and you leave in an hour and a half and do nothing about, but take the story to open up to harder conversations about race and reconciliation and what we can do in the future. But before I do that, there's a couple of items I want to share, and I think I'm a little short on time, so you'll have to forgive me. I'm kind of cutting some things here, but looking again at the shared relationship, I asked myself the question, what did people like Frederick Douglass know about German abolitionists? And when I dug into some of his writings, I found that he talked about German immigrant abolitionists all the time. In fact, he made a quite striking comment about Germans. And I want you to hear this to understand what it implies about his feeling about Germans. He says this: many noble and high-minded men, most of whom were swept over by the tide of revolution of 1848, have become our active allies against oppression and prejudice. A German, and this is his words, a German has only to be a German to be utterly opposed to slavery. Now, yes, it is true that Frederick Douglass, because of his stature as an abolitionist, he would more likely spend his time with other abolitionists within the German community. So his comment is not meant to be a sweeping generalization about all Germans, but it is certainly what he felt about those that he was involved with. And he was involved with German abolitionists throughout the United States, in Philadelphia, in New York, in the South, in Missouri. I'm reminded that when he came to St. Louis, the place that he came to was a Turner Hall, a place where Germans allowed Blacks and others to come. And he gave a speech that was there. In fact, shortly after that, as was pointed out by Miss Efford in her book, Arnold Krekel makes the comment to fellow Germans, I wouldn't be surprised if a Black man became president of the United States. Now imagine, at that time, shortly after the Civil War, he makes such a comment. Again, it came from relationships. History is meant to be given clearly and accurately, but it is also meant for those of us who want to see more understanding between groups, that it is translated in human terms, and that we get to the issues of nuance and gray, contradictions, why people sometimes do this but don't do that. Tell you a story that follows this line of thinking. I read a book by Dr. Savage, an African-American historian, that was commissioned by Lincoln University to look over the history of Lincoln. And he makes the comment, and listen to this carefully, he makes the comment in his book that Jesse James, the terrible outlaw, gave money to Lincoln for members of the colored infantry. He says that in his book about Lincoln. Now you have to ask yourself this question. Jesse James was part of the bushwhacker groups. They were violently against slavery, committed atrocities beyond belief. And yet, how is it possible that someone who was involved with bushwhackers would contribute money to a university? Now, some of the scholars that I've talked to have said, I don't believe it. I don't think Savage was right about that. Well, I don't know what the truth of that is, but based on what I've looked at and looking at us as human beings, I do think it is possible for there to have been the kind of relationship that Jesse James had with the 7 slaves on his farm. And I've done a little digging on that and some interesting information about that, that he would have such a relationship with those that were there, that once it was clear that the war was over, that he would contribute to an institute for some of the slaves that he grew up with. It is the nuance, the contradictions of what we deal with that we need to talk about. And so my hope is that the work that Sydney and I have done in bringing this to communities throughout Missouri puts something on our mind, that it is important to deal with the good, the bad, and the ugly. And it just in terms of time, I'm not sure how much time I have right now, but I think this might be a good time to go to the video so that you can see how we took the words from this 33-page historical research and made it so that it would bring people together to understand each other better. So if we could go to the video at this time, that's what I'd like to do.
Americans when I was 11 years old. When I met them, I felt fear.
They never told me I was brown or any other color or that I was any different from anybody else. My grandmothers were biracial. My grandmother was always telling me, just remember, God created all colors.
On a winter afternoon in Hermann, Missouri, a group of people gathered to share stories. Black people and white people sharing their memories of growing up in small Missouri towns in a time of strict segregation. In some cases, the segregation continued even after civil rights laws were enacted. The discussion was honest and candid, and no one shied away from difficult topics.
I was the first Black person to walk through the Davidson's Cafe and order me a cheeseburger and fries and not have to go in the back. In Montgomery City, if you want to go to the show, you had to go upstairs and sit.
Going upstairs, it was automatic, you know what I'm saying? So we didn't think, well, we'd rather sit downstairs. When I got to St. Louis, things like that would not have been tolerated. But that's all we knew, and just a handful of us, we wasn't going to raise any cane. That's what my grandfather calls it.
Well, excuse me. We decided to go to the movies since civil rights laws were signed and everything. Why shouldn't I be able to pay my 50 cents and sit on the first floor like everybody else? Sat on the first floor, yay, first time ever. Niggers can't sit here.
I grew up in an entirely segregated atmosphere.
Even those who came only to listen found themselves ready to share.
I did not see an African American until I was 7 or 8 years old, and I went to Brownie Day Camp, and I made friends with a little girl. I said, "Mother, I have a new friend. I made a new friend. Can she come over and play with me?" And I said, "But tell me something, Mother, I don't understand." She didn't look like me exactly. Her skin was dark. And my mother said, the upshot of it was, no, I couldn't invite my friend over to play with me.
But to say I'm going to be committed to this?
This powerful discussion didn't happen by chance. Cecilia Nadal extended an open invitation to African Americans and to whites of German heritage to share their experiences. She is a sociologist and playwright who is passionate about cross-cultural engagement. She became fascinated with a little-known slice of Missouri history. German immigrants who settled in Missouri were staunch abolitionists. The small town of Hermann, Missouri became ground zero for an anti-slavery movement.
These people came speaking German, never being in America before, having to find a place in the Wild West to live, where they're going to work, build houses, whatever they look like. Their challenges of acclimating to a new country were huge then. And yet, when it came to what position they would have on slavery, this group, particularly in Missouri, really had very firm notions about what democracy should look like, and whether they knew a black person or not, or a slave, we're just not going to come to a country and let that be, because we've come from a place that had terrible oppression. So we would be hypocrites if we did not stand up for what democracy should be.
The story inspired Cecilia to write a play that was performed in Hermann and in St. Louis.
Where would they go?
Called An Amazing Story, the drama portrays how German immigrants fought against slavery.
We are all Americans now, and the ideal of democracy belongs to all the many people of this great land.
One key figure in the history is Arnold Krekel. He was a federal judge who ran an anti-slavery newspaper. In 1854, he spearheaded the formation of Lincoln University in Jefferson City, the nation's first degree-granting historically black college. He also represented freedmen in disputes with employers. It was up to Cecilia as the playwright to imagine the conversations these real characters might have had.
The way I see it, we're all American. This is the only country I've ever known.
The play was the icebreaker, if you will, and only the beginning. Conversations like this continued the dialogue.
You know, Dad was the first tavern owner to ever serve a black man at the bar. He took a lot of static over that, a lot of static, and he lost some customers.
My family moved here in 1908. My family employed a lot of African American people. Henry Ellis worked for us on one of our farms across the river, and great family.
Since the discussion, Herman held its first ever Black History Month celebration. And some participants are attempting to find out if sundown laws have been repealed. Those laws once prohibited blacks from being out after dark. Building bridges and having face-to-face conversations, however difficult, are paths to healing and understanding, according to Cecilia.
The German immigrant abolitionist story was one that was extremely important for where we are today in America. Why? Because these were people who did not know the people they were fighting for, but on principle, they said, we're going to do something about it. They are an incredible example of what it means to be American, and that is to stand up for what we believe in.
And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free.
Great, thanks. But again, I want to thank you both so much for a fascinating overview and some very, very interesting stories. And that video was great. It's a wonderful way to kind of wrap things up. Really, really interesting. So I'm going to start off with a question of my own. And I'm curious to what extent I mean, I gathered a little bit of the stories there about some, a lot of the stories were about the Jim Crow era, obviously, because these were people that were remembering, their own family's experiences of segregation. To what extent have you gathered stories about Germans who were maybe more progressive, German Americans that were more progressive as far as integration of facilities was concerned, either businesses or defending business owners who were maybe, going out on a limb to welcome African Americans into their businesses, or to, again, sort of in the kind of post-slavery Jim Crow era, kind of take a public stand in the same way, in a similar way to what some of the German abolitionists had done before, the Civil War.
Okay. I'd be happy to, I am happy to tell you that we've heard many stories, and it's quite interesting. If you open a conversation on something that people normally don't talk about, you learn things that you've never heard before. And even in that tape that you just saw, one of the gentlemen who had the glasses on, and he talked about his father being a tavern owner, that was during World War II. And he opened up his bar because he felt it was important for all the people of Herman to come through. When I was in Hannibal, there was a German woman who told me about her family that were helping Blacks who lived in the area and how other people were scuffling about it and talking about it. She said, but we just went on our way and did what we wanted to do. I have to say that the determination of Germans and the discretion of Germans, their character has a lot to do with not hearing stories because they don't feel a need to tell them until you ask for them. And so it's really interesting that if you don't ask, you're not going to get it. And these were not people who were doing what they did for Blacks because they wanted someone to see it. They did it because they believed it and went on about their business. There is a very interesting integrity that I find with many Germans, not all, and certainly we're not trying to make a case that this is everywhere. But where it does exist, there's a lot of discretion, a lot of pride in doing it without needing to have the Joneses know about it.
Very interesting.
I wanted to just add one thing. At Lincoln University, as you heard, that was established for the formerly enslaved, but there's a tradition even today, it's mostly African American, but there are many students with German names from the area who go there. They're German students or German American students whose families were immigrants. And it's interesting how it's just continued over the years.
Very interesting. Yeah, it's the whole story of Lincoln University in Missouri is a new one to me, and so I'm intrigued to learn more about it. Another question: to what extent were churches? So there was a lot of segregation also on, say, the white side, the Euro-American side, where there were Germans and Anglos worshiping in separate churches. And you would have, like, say, German Lutheran churches, and you'd have English Lutheran churches, and so forth. There's a lot of sort of lines of ethnic separation and various kinds of barriers, even among whites, according to ethnicity, and sometimes also class and neighborhoods and that sort of thing too. To what extent do you see some sort of outreach on the part of, say, German churches, and maybe other religious organizations to kind of reaching out to African Americans, or not, potentially?
Well, that's a good one, because frankly, through my experience, and that experience being primarily in Missouri, I have found that the continuity of a liberal approach to interaction with African Americans has primarily come from what has been formerly called the German Evangelical Church. They have played, at least the evidence of that here, is that there's been more continuity. But if you look hard enough, you see a little of it in the Catholic Church, although many are very critical of the Catholic Church in its role in slavery in Missouri. There's good and bad. The Methodist Church, it's interesting that in the founding of Lincoln University, when they were looking for support, the Methodist Church, on one hand, said, we will support you, but we want white instructors to teach Black people. They insisted on that. And then there was another group that came in and said, no, we don't care if it's Black or white instructors, this is what we're going to do. So I would say it's fair to say that at least in Missouri, the German Evangelical Church shows much more evidence of that in my experience. But it's also true that within other churches, even the Lutheran Church, there's a gentleman, gosh, I wish I could remember his name, but it was he was a Black Lutheran. And we found out that there was a teaching institution in Greenville, I think it's North Carolina, where Blacks were taught to be Lutheran ministers, and they all were taught German. So they spoke German. And there is a story about a guy who went up and down the Missouri River and the Mississippi River to go to small German towns. And people were shocked when he arrived because he was Black. But after they got to know him, everyone said, oh, he's fine. We love him. You heard the stories of shock because it was a Black Lutheran minister, but you also heard the stories of people warming up and even embracing him. And I wish I could remember his name, but he's well known. He is well known.
That story I remember hearing as well, because there's a Wisconsin connection. I believe it was an African-American child who was adopted by German speakers in Milwaukee.
Huh.
And I think that was the sort of connection there. And then I did a little bit of research, and that he had attended this, there was a school, and then he went to the seminary, married an African-American woman from that area. And then they ended up moving to Michigan and passing as white.
Isn't
so
that
his
something?
background? Yeah, exactly. And
those stories need to be collected
Yes.
and given to people so they can see what has happened. Right now, they don't know those stories. I'm so glad. I'll have to look that one up that you mentioned. Yeah.
I'll share the information that I've gathered
Good,
with you too. You might,
good.
might be interested in that. So, yeah, and you had mentioned, for example, a Turner Hall that had welcomed African Americans, and that's something that I had never really thought of because Turner Halls, the Turner organizations were ubiquitous, basically in German American communities, and still are. You know, many exist today, and I'm curious as to what extent, they were, so how progressive they were really early on, even maybe say before the Civil War in terms of welcoming freed blacks there. Can you say more about the Turners?
That's a very good question. And it's interesting. There were a lot of Turners in St. Louis, so they had numbers on their side. And the Turners in St. Louis were all in favor of emancipation. They fought for it. And across the country, that was generally the rule. However, there were Turner societies in Charleston, for example, and a couple of other southern cities where maybe it's because they were fewer and they weren't able to make a statement in public as easily, but they decided not to support emancipation. And the St. Louis Turners wrote into the Anzeiger des Westens and wrote a letter to the Charleston Turners and said, you are no longer part of the National Turner Association, because they didn't follow what they believed to be right. And there's a letter in German that's been translated into English that talks about that. So most of them were anti-slavery, the large majority, but in the southern states, there were exceptions. There were Germans who fought on the Confederate side, but there were also small groups of people who were against slavery, even in Texas, for example, and they kind of, kept to themselves.
Interesting. Very interesting. So we have this is a comment that comes from David Ortman. Thank you, David. It says, just wanted to mention the book Exodusters, Black Migration to Kansas After Reconstruction by Neil Irvin Painter. And this was a story of the first major migration to the north of formerly enslaved people. And this is a book that was originally published in 1976.
Oh, thank you.
Interesting.
That's interesting.
Another question that I have is, to what extent, I've read about contacts between indigenous people, so Native Americans and African Americans, both before and after the Civil War, and obviously there was, intermarriage to a certain extent as well. Have you gotten stories at all about how indigenous people, Native Americans, may have kind of figured into the contacts between African Americans and German Americans?
I'm not sure that I can speak to specific stories, but keep in mind that about 25 to 30% of African Americans have Indian blood. And so I am sure that there were interactions in particular parts of the United States where you have indigenous people right alongside African Americans, where there are stories to be told in their involvement with Germans. I don't know specific stories, but I'm sure they're there, without a doubt.
Yeah, it'd be interesting.
This is a personal aside. I'm from Oklahoma, and I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. But the Cherokees, you've heard about the Indian schools that have basically a bad reputation. But in Oklahoma, they had a school, and it was established to use Smith College as a model. And the indigenous people there, the Cherokees, learned German. German was one of the languages that they were supposed to learn. And I have, older family members, they're no longer living, but one of them went to this school, and she said that she loved the school. So this is an odd exception to the rule, because there's so many terrible stories about them too.
The boarding schools, especially. Yeah. Thank you. We've got a question here from Joanne Tiedemann, a local person. she asks, the German Evangelical Church in Missouri could now today either be a Lutheran Church, Missouri Synod, or the United Church of Christ, part of the UCC group. Does either of you maybe know what
My
it's led to?
inclination is to tell you UCCC.
Okay, gotcha.
And the reason is because I've had people outreach to me from that group specifically, who have been heartwarming in supporting the play and the dialogue between Germans and African Americans.
That's great.
Just to mention another aspect of that, I happen to work in an archive, Missouri Synod archive. I catalog their German books, and they were not particular. First of all, Walter, who was the head of the Missouri Synod, he was actually a secessionist. So that is it's just kind of a polar opposite of the evangelical church to whom Rieger belonged to.
That's right.
Rieger, who was, but the people I work with up there are really interested in this development, and they want to find out more about it.
Great. Well, I find it absolutely fascinating to have sponsored these public discussions and these bringing people together. And I hope that COVID didn't do too much of a number in terms of like your ability to sponsor these events. Are there activities that are ongoing now in terms of still kind of bringing folks together, facilitating these public conversations?
We would love to see that happen. But I have to tell you that the energy and the support that needs to be given to ongoing dialogues is huge. And yet, I have to tell you, I think we're at a time that it's absolutely essential to do it. And there's no question about it. There are individuals who continue to have dialogue. I have the people that I've met in Hannibal, in Warrenton, in Jefferson City, in St. Louis. It has been phenomenal to have all these Germans sort of come out of the closet to talk about, what they believe and what they support. And for me, that's been astounding. My for lack of a better term, my e-list is huge. And these are people who want to keep dialogue going. So I have been doing a lot of thinking about the question of continuity and the importance of trying to develop centers of energy where that's the case. But if you go into a town and you put in a year to make the first meeting happen, then you've got to have people that you have worked with to help them understand how to continue to facilitate those kinds of things. So you've got training of the trainers that needs to occur. Mm-hmm. So we need a macro strategy and a macro strategy that has supports to make that happen. But we do know this, that it works when you do it. And so whenever we can get that kind of support and bring in both the rural as well as the urban element, I think it's going in the right direction.
That's great. Well, we have just a little bit of time left, and we have one more question. This is a fairly specific question. Is the play available to groups to present or to maybe purchase the script? Is there some way that this could be disseminated, perhaps?
Well, we would love to remount the play without question. I would be happy to talk to people about displaying the play, but I will tell you that I'm already doing some revisions to it based on what has happened. So if people are interested in bringing the play, I'm the one to talk to. If they want to get information on it, it is copywritten, so we have to come to some sort of agreement on how that's done, but I'm completely open because the conversation needs to take place.
Great. So if we get some inquiries for you and also Sydney about sort of, kind of things to make this more sustainable, can we just pass them on to you?
Absolutely.
So if we just invite folks to give us some feedback?
Either one of us, you can send it to. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, again, Yeah, go ahead.
I did want to just mention one thing. The publication, I have a discount code. If anybody is interested in purchasing the book, I'd be happy to just send Antje or you an email with the discount code, and you get like a 25 or 30% off.
Perfect.
If anybody's interested.
Very nice. Great. Well, again, thank you both so much for a wonderful, engaging presentation, multimedia. The content gives us a lot to think about, and I think to inspire us to think about similar kinds of stories, maybe outside of Missouri, in the places that we're coming from as well. But I know, speaking for myself, I've learned a lot of things that I just had no knowledge of before, and I'm just grateful to you both for taking the time to share with us.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you
so
so much. We really enjoyed it.
Good. Take care. We'll be in touch. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
And thanks everybody for joining us tonight at this virtual event sponsored by the Max Kade Institute. Wish everybody a healthy and happy holiday season as well.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.